We've just heard the story of two men that found themselves in hot water, didn't they? When they spoke up about Jesus and what Jesus could do in the lives of people. When God's power was manifested in front of them. You know, in many ways, followers of Christ are a lot like a tea bag. Tea bags are containers. They contain tea leaves. Just as Christ followers are containers of Christ. Christ, like the tea leaves, lives within us, we're told by the Scriptures. But you know, we often don't see what's going on inside that tea bag. We don't know what the fragrance, the aroma is of the tea until actually we see hot water poured out and the tea, the natural juices trapped inside that tea begin to flow out and enter into the water. And then we begin to see really what was inside. So often as Christians, people don't know the God life inside of us until they see actually us in times of trials, when things aren't going so well. We sang just a moment ago a story, a hymn by Horatio Gates Spafford. I wonder how many of you know a little bit about Spafford and his story, about how he went through hot waters. The line from the hymn, though Christ or Satan should buffet, Satan should attack, though trials should come, only scratch the surface of what this man went through. In 1871, Spafford lost a great deal of his real estate investments, and he spent the next 2 years helping the over 100,000 homeless in that city get back on their feet. And as he was ministering to the grieving and the poor, his only son passed away. When the relief efforts were over, Spafford decided to take his family to England to hear the great evangelist Dwight L. Moody speak in the London Crusades. Spafford had some business to take care of, so he was wrapping that up and sent his wife and 4 daughters ahead of him. But their ship never arrived at its destination. Off the coast of Newfoundland, they collided with another ship, and in 20 minutes, the ship was under the water. Spafford's 4 daughters, including Grace and Bertha, who are pictured here on the screen, perished in that accident. His wife, Anna, was one of only 42 survivors. Some say that Spafford wrote the words to the hymn, "It is well with my soul," or "What peace like a river," as he was passing that point where the ship had gone down on his way to meet his wife, who was waiting in England. His wife and he are pictured here on the screen, and it was the evangelist Dwight L. Moody that asked Spafford how he was holding up after his loss. And he replied, "It is well with my soul." Listen to these words, that Christ has regarded my helpless estate and shed his own blood for my soul. It is well with my soul. A few weeks ago, we talked about our favorite songs or hymns here at Souderton Mennonite Church. And this hymn, "When Peace Like a River," or "It Is Well With My Soul," was one of the top songs or hymns that our church cherishes. And I think if we look at Spafford and we think of that illustration of the tea bag, certainly his willingness to praise God in the pits permeated the world around him, even well beyond his own lifetime. I've never walked, maybe you haven't either, in a valley as deep and dark as Spafford's. But I can remember my own in October 6, 2000, when I wrote this entry in my journal. "Dear God, I don't understand why life is turning out the way it is. Will it get better? I see so many things around me that don't make sense. Take my broken and directionless life and put it back together for your glory." You know, as Christ followers, we're not promised smooth sailing. Jesus said that in this world we would have trouble. Peter, one of Jesus' disciples, said that don't be surprised if you go through trials here in this world. Maybe you're going through one right now, or have been during the past year. Wherever you are or wherever you've been, though, this is what I hope we'll remember this morning. And that is that we may not realize how our choice to praise and worship God in the pits when life is at its lowest is just what someone who is struggling with despair needs to regain hope. That's the message of this story from Acts 16, of how God brought incredible goodness out of something that was so horrific and terrible. Let's take a look at the story in Acts 16. A mob quickly formed against Paul and Silas, and the city's officials ordered them stripped and beaten with wooden rods. They were severely beaten, and they were thrown into prison. The jailer was ordered to make sure that they didn't escape. So the jailer put them into the inner dungeon and clamped their feet in the stocks. Clearly, Paul and Silas' story is a reminder to us that if you and I choose to follow Christ, we will encounter opposition. That we'll bump up against the opposition of our culture that's going in the opposite direction. In Men's Monday Night Football Fellowship this last week, we're looking at a book by Bill Farrell, The 10 Best Decisions a Man Can Make. And in the book, Farrell mentioned this about the opposition that we encounter in this life. He said, Jesus said, "Broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But narrow is the road that leads to life, and only a few find it." For most of my life, I pictured, writes Farrell, these two words as parallel paths that then veer off into different directions. My thinking, though, was transformed when I pictured the narrow road going in the opposite direction in the middle of the wide road. That would be like if all the traffic is heading south on 309 and you're right in the middle of it, heading north, going the opposite direction. And we know that if we're doing that, people will notice. They can tell that we are going against the current. They may criticize us or make fun of us or even lobby for us to turn around and join them in going in their direction. Jesus promised us that we would encounter opposition in this world. That sometimes Christ's followers will end up in the pits. The path that Paul and Silas walked along took them to solitary confinement. Now, what will that look like in our lives? It could mean that we may have to disappoint people whose opinion matters more to us than anything else. It might mean opposing unethical business practices and risking our career in doing so. But clearly this is the decision in following Christ. We may find ourselves in the pits. But the question when we find ourselves in hot water is, what will we do in that moment? How will we react to it? Will those natural juices, will the presence of Christ seep out into the world around us? Or will they remain trapped inside as we struggle to come to terms with what's going on and perhaps become bitter and resentful? Paul and Silas chose not to mope or to sing the blues or to allow the gloom and the darkness to overcome them and extinguish the light within them. We read that around midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God. But listen to this. The other prisoners were listening. Why do you think they were listening? Well, picture for yourself, Paul and Silas were put in the inner dungeon. What was the inner dungeon? It was deep down, underground. It was probably a smelly pit. And it was dark. And so all these other prisoners that are in cells where light and air can flow in freely, they're listening to these men who are in much worse circumstances than them, singing and giving praise to their God. Well, like those prisoners, when you and I are in hot water, there are people who are listening and watching our lives, wondering what's going on in there. Now let's see what their faith looks like. You know, I thought so often, these are packets of tea. You know, when people see us and we look picture perfect, I don't think they necessarily wonder what's going on behind that. They'd probably say, wow, if they knew what life was like for me. It's really not until we're in the hot water, till they see the brokenness of our lives, the disappointments, the hardships, that they begin to recognize really Christ's presence. Because you know, who we are when life is hard is really what gets noticed. Think about it. When Satan was talking to God and God was boasting about Job and saying Job was this amazing man who was faithful and righteous and holy, someone that God was very proud of, Satan said this, well, God, Job has good reason to fear you. You've always put a wall of protection around him and his home and his property. You've made him prosper in everything he does. Look how rich he is. But reach out and take away everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face. Imagine what it was like when Satan heard Job say these words, when his children, his health, his wealth was all stripped from him. He said, God might kill me, but I have no other hope. I'm going to argue my case with him. I think what Job was saying here is if God would do the unthinkable and kill me, he is my last resort. He is my only hope. I put my trust in the Lord. So no matter what happens around me, God is my hope. Well, there are people just like those prisoners in the Philippian jail who are listening to our lives, just as there were people looking at Job's life. And some of them, like this jailer that we heard about in the story, might even ask for an explanation of where the hope comes from for those who are following Christ. Paul and Silas's witness prompted the jailer who was ready to take his life to ask the question, what must I do to be saved? And you and I may be asked to give an answer to the hope that we have. Peter, Jesus' disciple, says that we ought to be prepared when someone asks us where our hope comes from. If someone asks you, writes Peter, about your Christian hope, always be ready to explain it. I think sharing our faith and explaining what God does in our lives sometimes is so deeply personal that it's hard to be able to put it into words in a way that someone can be able to identify with and hear it in their language. But clearly, when people look at our lives in the midst of pain and hardship, they're wondering, where does it come from? How do you walk through that? How do you still continue to follow when this is happening in your life?